8%. That is the slice of China's artificial intelligence accelerator market that Nvidia holds today, measured against a position that, before the export controls arrived, was effectively the whole of it. In the period before October 2022, estimates from semiconductor market research firms placed Nvidia's share of that market above 90%. Two readings, more than 80 percentage points of distance between them, compressed into roughly 2 to 3 years. One metric runs through what follows: Nvidia's share of China's artificial intelligence accelerator market by revenue, then and now, with the mechanism that moved it and the reasons the number should be read carefully before it is read as final. Above 90% pre-2022, 8% 2024 into 2025. Above 90. 8. The gap is not a rounding error. Before the October 2022 export control expansion, the Chinese artificial intelligence accelerator market and Nvidia's order books were, for practical purposes, the same thing in this segment. Chinese cloud platforms, artificial intelligence laboratories, and enterprise buyers procured Nvidia hardware as a matter of course. Domestic alternatives existed but held marginal share, treated by buyers as fallback options for less demanding workloads rather than primary platforms for large-scale model training. The market was not competitive in any ordinary sense. One supplier held the commanding position not because regulation forced it there, but because no domestically produced chip had yet demonstrated the performance, software ecosystem depth, or supply reliability to displace it. That position carried a specific fragility that was not visible in the share number itself. It depended entirely on the legal availability of the product. Remove the product from the market and the share number has nowhere to go but down. October 2022 is the date that marks the before reading from the after reading. The Bureau of Industry and Security in the United States expanded its export controls to cover the highest capability artificial intelligence chips, including Nvidia's most powerful data center products, blocking their sale into China without a license that, in practice, was not being granted. Nvidia's initial response was to design chips specifically tuned to fall just below the performance thresholds that triggered the restriction, attempting to preserve legal access to the China market at reduced capability. That compliance window opened in late 2022 and ran into 2023. It then closed. Subsequent rounds of tightening updated the performance thresholds to encompass the modified products. Each time Nvidia produced a variant calibrated to clear the line moved to include it. The regulatory body was iterating on a faster cycle than the product development calendar, which meant the middle ground product category Nvidia had tried to establish was eliminated not by any single rule change, but by the cumulative pace of successive ones. The compliance window lasted roughly 12 to 18 months before it was no longer a window. The successive rule updates that document this pattern are established fact. The precise timeline is approximate, drawn from publicly available rulemaking records. What happened to the share number during that interval is the reading that requires care. Above 90% before the controls. 8% in 2024 to 2025. The figure of 8% comes from semiconductor market research firms working from customs data, channel checks, and inference rather than from audited revenue reported by all market participants. Chinese domestic chip companies do not publish market share data in a form that outside analysts can independently verify. The 8% is the best available estimate from specialist firms with long track records in this segment. It is not a meter on a sealed pipe. Treat it as a well-informed reading with meaningful uncertainty attached, not as a certified count. With that caveat stated, the direction of the movement is not in dispute. Nvidia's share fell, and it fell sharply. The share that vacated did not evaporate. It moved. The first interpretation of that movement is also the most important one to get right. The share drop does not mean China bought fewer artificial intelligence chips. It means China bought different ones. Total accelerator procurement in China grew over the same interval that Nvidia's share of it fell. The market expanded while the dominant supplier contracted inside it. A falling share in a rising market is a more significant signal than a falling share in a flat one because it indicates substitution rather than austerity. The buyers did not pause, they redirected. They, the procurement that would have cleared Nvidia's order books, cleared domestic suppliers' backlogs instead. That substitution is the primary mechanism behind the share delta, and it has a secondary effect that compounds over time. Volume orders placed with domestic suppliers became the funding mechanism for the next generation of domestic chips. The second interpretation reaches into how industrial policy actually operates in practice. because the export controls functioned as an involuntary industrial policy for China's domestic semiconductor sector, whether or not that outcome was intended. By removing the option of purchasing the most capable external chips, procurement decisions that would have been straightforward became urgent substitution problems. Chinese cloud companies and artificial intelligence laboratories that could not wait indefinitely for a compliant Nvidia product made volume commitments to domestic suppliers instead. Those commitments carried multi-year timelines, and multi-year volume commitments are precisely the signal that semiconductor fabrication capacity and chip design investment need to justify scale. The restriction created the demand signal that domestic silicon needed to move from marginal to competitive. Before the controls, domestic chips were present in the market, but not competitive at scale for the most demanding workloads. By 2024 into 2025, the bulk of the share Nvidia vacated had moved to domestic suppliers, with the remainder distributed among other non-United States sources. From marginal to majority within roughly 3 years. Marginal then, majority now. The mechanism behind that shift is worth tracing through a single concrete chain. A Chinese cloud company in 2021 places a large order for Nvidia hardware for a training cluster. That order clears, the cluster goes online, and the company's procurement team begins planning the next expansion cycle with the same supplier. October 2022 arrives. The preferred product is now restricted. The modified product arrives in late 2022, and the company waits to see if it will clear compliance review. The modified product is added to the control list in 2023. The company's expansion is delayed. Its training roadmap has a gap. A domestic supplier that has been courting this buyer for 2 years now offers a volume deal with a guaranteed delivery schedule. The cloud company signs a multi-year commitment. That commitment goes on to the domestic supplier's order book. The order book justifies a new round of yield improvement investment at the fab. 18 months later, the fab is running at higher yields. The performance gap between what the domestic chip can do and what the restricted Nvidia product could have done has not closed entirely, but it has narrowed enough that the cloud company's training workloads are running on domestic hardware at scale. The company is now a reference customer. Other buyers observe the reference. The share number moves again. That is the chain in one instance. Multiply it across the major Chinese cloud and artificial intelligence laboratory buyers, and the aggregate is what the 8% reading reflects. Think of it this way. A city that pipes all its water from one reservoir upstream loses access to the pipe. The city does not reduce its water use. It digs its own wells. The wells are slower to develop and harder to maintain, but the city funds them because the alternative is to wait for a pipe that may never reopen. By the time the upstream authority considers restoring flow, the city has committed capital to the wells and has institutional reasons to keep using them even if the pipe reopens. The restriction did not reduce the city's water. It changed who got paid to supply it. The third interpretation is the one that makes the 8% figure most uncertain as a forward-looking signal. The share number is a lagging indicator. By the time revenue data is compiled into a market share estimate, the design wins and volume orders that will determine next year's share have already been placed. If domestic chip yield rates have continued to improve over the period since the last data was collected, and available evidence suggests they have, then 8% is not the floor on Nvidia's share. It is a reading taken partway down a still-moving instrument. The performance gap between domestic Chinese artificial intelligence accelerators and Nvidia's current unrestricted top-tier products is real and has not closed. Domestic suppliers have disclosed benchmark figures for their chips that close a portion of the gap. Benchmarks are run under controlled conditions on workloads selected to show the chip favorably. Sustained throughput on real large-scale training clusters at the yields and reliability rates that make a chip economically viable for continuous production use is a different measurement entirely, and that data is not public. The delta in stated performance and the delta in practical production capability may not be the same number. Before the controls, Chinese artificial intelligence laboratories treated domestic silicon as a fallback for less demanding workloads. By 2024 into 2025, large-scale training runs are being completed on domestic hardware at volume, which was not happening in 2021. The classification has changed from fallback to primary platform for a meaningful portion of workloads. That reclassification happened not only through hardware improvement, but through software optimization layers, compiler work, and cluster-level interconnect engineering that partially substituted for raw chip-level performance. The hardware gap is real. Its practical consequence has shrunk faster than the gap itself. That gap matters for how the share trajectory should be read going forward. The path from above 90% to 8% ran through territory where the remaining obstacles for domestic suppliers were getting easier with each cycle. The path from 8% to whatever comes next runs through harder territory. Advanced packaging yields, high bandwidth memory availability, and the distance between what Chinese fabrication facilities can produce at volume and what the leading edge of artificial intelligence chip design currently requires are the constraints that the share trajectory has not yet fully encountered. The slope that carried the number from above 90 to 8 is not guaranteed to be the slope that carries it from 8 to wherever it lands next. The trend line's direction is well attested. Its rate is not. 3 reasons the delta could mislead, then 1 synthesis. First, the share estimate is built from inference and channel checks, not audited revenue from all participants, so the number carries more uncertainty than a figure from a regulated financial filing. Second, the performance benchmarks disclosed by domestic suppliers reflect controlled test conditions, not sustained production throughput, so the capability gap may be smaller on paper than in practice. Third, the physical constraints ahead, on packaging yields, memory bandwidth, and fabrication node capability are more demanding than the ones already passed, so the pace of the transition is unlikely to be constant even if the direction holds. The synthesis. The delta is real, its magnitude is an estimate, and its continuation is not guaranteed by the same mechanisms that produced it. A reading that names its own uncertainty is more reliable than one that does not, and this metric carries more uncertainty than most. What the delta between above 90% and 8% actually proves is narrower and more precise than the headline number suggests. It proves that a dominant supplier can be displaced in a major market within a 2 to 3 year window when procurement decisions are forced by regulation rather than by preference. It does not prove that the displacement produces equivalent capability. It does not prove the trajectory is permanent. It does not prove that the domestic alternatives are now running the full range of workloads that the displaced product was running. What it proves is that the share number moved, and that the mechanism designed to hold it in place is what moved it. The restriction was written as a ceiling on capability held in place by Nvidia's supply. Nvidia's share is now 8%. The ceiling kept Nvidia out. It did not keep the capability number flat. Above 90% before the controls. 8% now, above 90, 8. The metric and the policy that was supposed to stabilize it are now pointing in the same direction, and neither of them is pointing back. The next reading to watch arrives in the next procurement cycle, roughly 12 months out. The question that reading will answer is not whether Nvidia's share falls below 8%, though it may. The question is whether, at whatever number it reaches, the domestic alternatives are completing production workloads that were previously only possible on the chips that are no longer there. That is the measurement that will tell us whether the share number was the story or only the place where the story started. If you want that reading when it lands, with the same before, after, and delta, subscribe and turn on notifications and it will be here.